The metal casing felt wrong in Corporal Jimmy McLeod's hands. Too light, too narrow, like someone at the munitions factory had made a terrible mistake and sent them children's toys instead of tank ammunition. He turned the shell over, examining the strange, segmented sleeve that wrapped around a slim tungsten core. It looked like a dart wearing armor 3 sizes too big. What the hell is this supposed to be? Private Bobby Chin asked, squinting at another round from the wooden crate. The young driver wiped frost from his glasses, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid Belgian air. Around them, other crews from the Canadian 2nd Armored Brigade huddled near their Sherman tanks, equally confused by the morning's resupply delivery. Sergeant Thomas Brennan stepped closer, his weathered face skeptical. At 31, he was ancient by tank crew standards. Most commanders didn't survive past their 2nd tank kill. Brennan was on his 3rd Sherman, having crawled out of 2 burning wrecks. The scars on his hands told stories he refused to share. Logistics officer called them sabot rounds, Brennan said, pronouncing the French word awkwardly. Some experimental program. Said the metal casing falls off after firing. Leaves just the penetrator. He shook his head. Looks like a skinny kid trying to wear his father's coat. Laughter rippled through the gathered crews, but it was hollow. Fear had a way of making everything sound like a funeral joke. They all knew what was coming. Intelligence had confirmed it 3 hours ago. German armor moving through the Ardennes forest. 3 Tiger tanks leading the column. The words had hit the Canadian camp like a physical blow. Tiger tanks. 60 tons of steel and terror. Their 88mm guns could punch through a Sherman's armor from over a mile away, while the Sherman's standard 75mm rounds bounced off Tiger frontal armor like pebbles thrown at a fortress wall. The crews had a nickname for their tanks. Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter. Lights first time, every time. It was supposed to be funny. Nobody laughed anymore. McLeod had stopped laughing 3 months ago in Normandy. His brother Tommy had been a gunner too, in a different crew. They'd encountered a Tiger near Cannes. Jimmy had listened to his brother's final radio transmission. The words burned into his memory forever. It won't penetrate. It won't. Then static. Just static and smoke rising from a field of French wheat. Load the regular shells, one of the other tank commanders announced, tossing his sabot round back into its crate. I'm not trusting my life to whatever mad scientist dreamed this up. Murmurs of agreement followed. Proven ammunition, even if it barely worked, felt safer than something that looked like a manufacturing error. But Jimmy kept staring at the odd shell in his hands. The tungsten core was dense, heavier than it looked. The segmented sabot casing was precision machined, clearly designed to separate cleanly. Someone had put serious engineering into this. Someone believed it would work. "We'll take them," Jimmy heard himself say. The conversations died. Crews turned to stare. Brennan's eyes narrowed. "Say again, McLeod." "Our tank. We'll load the sabot rounds. Test them." Jimmy's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. He thought of Tommy's last words, the desperate realization that their ammunition was useless against Tiger armor. He thought of other crews, other brothers, burning in their steel coffins because their weapons couldn't touch the enemy. "You've lost your mind," another sergeant muttered. "Those things look like they'll fall apart in the barrel. Or maybe they'll actually work," Bobbychin said quietly, stepping beside Jimmy. The young driver's loyalty was instant and unquestioning, even if his voice shook. Brennan studied his gunner for a long moment. The Irishman had been in enough fights to recognize the look in Jimmy's eyes. It wasn't courage. It wasn't even revenge. It was something colder, more dangerous. Acceptance. The look of a man who had already made peace with dying. "All right," Brennan said finally. "We'll be the guinea pigs. But if these rounds jam or explode in our own gun, McLeod, I'm haunting you personally." They spent the next hour loading the strange ammunition. Each sabot round slid smoothly into the breech, the segmented casing fitting perfectly despite its odd appearance. Jimmy ran through the loading drill until his movements became automatic. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. He tried not to think about whether the rounds would actually penetrate German armor or just make them easier targets when they failed WWII noon. Word came down. The German column was 12 miles out and closing. 3 Tigers confirmed, plus supporting Panzer IVs and half-tracks. The Canadians would set up an ambush at the forest edge, use terrain and surprise to offset their disadvantage. It was a good plan. It was also probably suicide. McLeod climbed into his gunner's position, the cramped interior of the Sherman closing around him like a metal tomb. The smell was familiar: diesel fuel, gun oil, old sweat, fear. Bobby settled into the driver's seat below, his hands already gripping the controls. Brennan stood in the commander's cupola, scanning the gray winter landscape through binoculars. "Contact in 30 minutes, Brennan's voice crackled through the intercom. "Stay sharp." Jimmy rested his hand on the breech, feeling the cold metal. Beside him sat the stack of sabot rounds, their strange shapes a silent promise or a lie. He didn't know which yet. He only knew that when the Tigers came, when those massive guns swept toward them, he would find out if the odd-shaped shells were a miracle or a cruel joke. In the distance, faint but growing louder, came the rumble of heavy engines. The Tigers were coming, and this time, the Shermans would fight back with something new, something the German crews had never seen before, something they would never expect from the inferior Allied tanks. The wait began. Lieutenant Carl Fischer had stopped believing in invincibility somewhere between Kursk and Normandy, but his crew hadn't learned that lesson yet. They stood in their Tiger tank's turret, watching the Belgian countryside roll past, acting like gods surveying their kingdom. Young Hans, the gunner, was actually humming. The sound made Fischer's jaw tighten. "Herr Lieutenant, do you think the Americans will even try to fight?" Hans asked, his voice carrying that dangerous confidence of someone who had never lost. "Their Shermans are nothing against our armor." "Canadians," Fischer corrected quietly. "Intelligence says Canadian units hold this sector." He had fought Canadians before at Cannes. They didn't quit easily, even when they should. That made them either brave or stupid, and in war, the line between the two was drawn in blood. The Tiger's engine roared beneath them, a Maybach HL-230 producing 700 horsepower that propelled 60 tons of steel at 25 miles per hour. The tank's frontal armor measured 100 millimeters thick, angled to deflect shots. Its 88 millimeters KWK 36L/56 gun could destroy any Allied tank from ranges that kept the Tigers safe from return fire. The specifications were impressive. They had saved Fischer's life multiple times, but specifications couldn't account for the weight in his gut, the instinct honed by too many battles. Something felt wrong about this advance. The forest ahead was too quiet. The perfect ambush terrain. "Contact front," the driver's voice cracked through the intercom. Multiple Shermans, tree line, 800 meters. Fischer's binoculars snapped up. There they were. 5, maybe 6 Canadian tanks partially concealed in the winter vegetation. Their long guns pointed toward the German column like accusing fingers. He felt his crew tense with anticipation rather than fear. They had faced Shermans dozens of times. This would be another easy victory. "All tanks, battle formation," Fischer ordered into the radio. "Engage at 700 meters. Watch for." The nearest Canadian Sherman fired. Too early. Too desperate. The shell streaked across the frozen field and sparked off Fischer's Tiger's glassy plate, ricocheting harmlessly into the sky. Inside the tank, the impact sounded like someone tapping on a church bell with a small hammer. Annoying, but meaningless. Hans laughed. "They might as well throw rocks at us, Herr Lieutenant." Fischer didn't respond. His mind was calculating angles, distances, threats. The Canadians were firing from too far out, revealing their positions prematurely. Either they were poorly trained, or another Sherman fired. Then another. Shell sparked and bounced off the lead Tigers. The German crews jeered over the radio, their voices drunk on perceived superiority. One commander made jokes about Canadian mosquitoes being more dangerous than Canadian tanks. "Return fire," Fischer commanded. His gunner traversed the turret smoothly, the 88 millimeters gun locking onto a target. On the way, the Tiger's gun roared. Through his binoculars, Fischer watched the Canadian Sherman explode, its turret lifting clear off the hull in a mushroom of flame and black smoke. The crew never had time to bail out. 1 second they were fighting, the next they were ash and memory. Target destroyed, Hans shouted triumphantly. The Tigers rolled forward, unstoppable. Their guns spoke again and again. Another Canadian tank backed away frantically, its commanders nerve-broken. The German crews felt like ancient warriors facing primitive tribes. This wasn't combat. It was slaughter. Fischer's Tiger closed to 600 meters. Then 500. The Canadians were still firing, their desperation palpable. Shells continued to bounce uselessly off German armor. The mathematics of the engagement were brutal and simple. Tiger armor could withstand Sherman guns at these ranges, but Sherman armor collapsed like paper against 88mm rounds. It wasn't a fair fight. It never had been a T-400 meters. Something changed. Fischer noticed it first. One Canadian Sherman, partially hidden behind a small rise, hadn't fired yet. It sat motionless, its gun tracking his Tiger with unnatural patience. The other Canadian tanks were panicking, but this crew waited. Professional, disciplined, dangerous. Hans, target that Sherman at 10 o'clock. The Canadian tank fired. Fischer saw the muzzle flash. His mind, trained by countless engagements, began the automatic calculation. Range, angle, armor thickness. The shell would bounce. They always bounced at this angle against frontal armor. The crew would die seconds later when Hans returned fire. Another Canadian crew sacrificed to German engineering superiority. Then the world ended. The impact didn't sound like previous hits. It didn't spark or ricochet. Instead, Fischer heard a sound like a giant hammer striking a bronze gong, followed immediately by a scream of tearing metal. His tank lurched violently. Inside the crew compartment, hell arrived faster than thought. The radio operator, sitting directly in the shell's path, simply ceased to exist. The tungsten penetrator, traveling at supersonic speed after punching through 100mm of armor, brought with it a jet of molten steel and superheated gas. Fragments ricocheted through the cramped interior like angry hornets. Fischer was thrown against the turret wall. His ears rang, his vision blurred. Through the chaos, he heard Hans screaming. Not in pain, in terror. The gunner's hands were burned, his face bleeding from shrapnel. The loader was unconscious. Smoke filled the compartment, choking them. Out, 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 Fischer shouted, his voice distant and strange through damaged eardrums. Ammunition was cooking off, the brass casings beginning to ignite from the heat. They had seconds before the entire ammunition storage detonated. The crew bailed with practiced desperation, tumbling into snow that felt like ice against burned skin. Fischer rolled away from his tank, his invincible fortress that had saved him from Russia to France. Behind him, flames licked from a neat hole punched through the frontal armor. A hole. Through the front. The impossible had happened. Fischer turned to look at the Canadian lines. The Sherman that had fired was already traversing to a new target, its odd-shaped shell having done what every Allied tanker had dreamed of doing, killing a Tiger from the front. Over the radio came panicked German voices. What happened? What hit you? Fischer, report. He couldn't answer. His radio was still in the burning tank. He could only watch as another Canadian round streaked across the battlefield, impossibly fast, impossibly thin. The second Tiger in line tried to reverse, its commander finally understanding the danger. Too late. The penetrator punched through the turret ring. The 60-ton monster shuddered, stopped, began to burn up. Fischer's mind refused to accept reality. Tigers didn't die like this. Sherman guns couldn't penetrate Tiger frontal armor. The mathematics didn't work. The engineering didn't allow it. But his burning tank argued otherwise. Around him, his crew stared in shock. Hans kept repeating one word. Unmöglich. 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 Impossible. But there was, smoking in the snow, proof that German superiority was a myth that could be shattered by a shell that looked wrong, a shell the German crews would have mocked if they'd seen it. A shell that changed everything. Jimmy McLeod's hands moved through the loading sequence automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had frozen. His mind was still processing what his eyes had seen. The sabot casing falling away mid-flight like petals from a flower, the tungsten dart continuing forward, and then the tiger, the unstoppable, invincible tiger, dying. Just dying, as if it were made of tin instead of forged steel. Holy Mother of God, Brennan whispered over the intercom, his Irish accent thickening with shock. It went through. Jimmy, it actually went through. Bobby Chin's voice came up from the driver's position, high and trembling. Did we just kill a tiger? From the front? Did that really happen? Another sabot round slid into the breach. Jimmy's training overrode his disbelief. The battle wasn't over. 2 tigers were burning, but the third remained operational, backing away in confusion. German Panzer IVs were trying to cover the retreat, their commanders shouting contradictory orders over jammed radio frequencies. The entire German formation had dissolved into chaos. Target, Panzer IV, 3 o'clock, Brennan called out, his voice steadying with the familiar rhythm of combat. Range 400. Jimmy swung the gun. Through his sight, he watched German tank crews abandoning their vehicles without even attempting to fight. They had seen their Tigers fall. If the mighty Tigers couldn't protect them, what chance did lesser tanks have? The psychological foundation of German armored superiority had cracked, and fear poured through like water through a shattered dam. Around McLeod-Sherman, other Canadian tanks found their courage. Crews who had been ready to retreat now pressed forward, loading their own sabot rounds with trembling hands and desperate hope. The odd shells that they had mocked hours ago were suddenly the most valuable objects on the battlefield out on the German side. Lieutenant Fischer knelt in the snow, watching his tank burn. His crew huddled nearby, faces blackened with smoke, eyes wide with shock. Hans, the gunner who had been humming confidently 20 minutes ago, wept openly. Not from pain, though his burned hands must have hurt terribly. From a shattering of everything he believed. How? Hans kept asking, staring at the hole punched through the Tiger's glassy plate. Oh, Lieutenant, how is this possible? The armor. Our armor. Fischer had no answer. He had studied ballistics, knew the penetration capabilities of every Allied tank gun. Sherman's 75mm rounds could not penetrate Tiger frontal armor. It was physics, mathematics, proven fact. Yet 2 Tigers burned as evidence that facts could be wrong. The third Tiger continued backing away, its commander's voice breaking over the abandoned radio inside Fischer's burning tank. All units retreat. Repeat, all units fall back. We cannot engage. The panic in his voice was worse than any wound. German tank commanders did not panic. They were professionals, products of superior training and equipment. But professionalism meant nothing when your armor turned out to be illusion. Canadian infantry began advancing through the snow, weapons ready. Fischer raised his hand slowly, signaling surrender. His war was over. Perhaps that was mercy. He had survived Stalingrad, Kursk, Normandy, the Ardennes. He had seen the Wehrmacht's slow collapse from overwhelming might to desperate defense. This defeat, though, felt different. Final. The Allies didn't just have more tanks. They now had tanks that could fight on equal terms, or better than equal terms, Fischer realized, watching Canadian Shermans pursue the retreating German column. The sabot rounds gave lighter, faster tanks the ability to kill heavier opponents. Suddenly, mobility mattered more than armor thickness. The entire doctrine of German tank warfare had been obsoleted in a single engagement. Inside McLeod-Sherman, the crew began to understand what they had accomplished. Brennan was coordinating with other tanks over the radio, his voice gaining confidence with each transmission. Bobby drove them forward cautiously, watching for ambush positions. And Jimmy sat at his gun, feeling nothing. He had imagined this moment countless times since Tommy died. The moment when he could strike back, when he could kill a tiger the way tigers had killed his brother. He had expected to feel triumph, satisfaction, revenge's sweet release. Instead, he felt hollow, empty. The tiger burning in the distance was just metal and fire. It wouldn't bring Tommy back, wouldn't undo the 3 months of nightmares and guilt. You okay, Jimmy? Brennan asked quietly, noticing his gunner's silence. Yeah, Sarge. I'm fine. The lie came easily. What else could he say? That killing the tiger felt meaningless? That he wanted to feel something, anger, joy, anything, but instead felt like an empty shell casing after firing. The battle wound down over the next hour. Canadian artillery found the retreating German column, adding to the chaos. By sunset, the field belonged to the Canadians. 3 Tigers destroyed or captured. Multiple Panzer IVs abandoned. German casualties scattered across frozen ground. The cost for the Canadians was lighter than expected, but still brutal. 2 Shermans destroyed before the sabot rounds proved their worth. 11 men dead, their bodies being collected by grave registration teams as evening fell. 11 families would receive telegrams. 11 sets of personal effects would be shipped home as darkness gathered. McLeod climbed out of his Sherman and sat on the turret, watching the smoke rise from the dead Tigers. Other crews celebrated nearby, passing around cigarettes and retelling the engagement with growing enthusiasm. Already the story was becoming legend. The day Canadian Shermans killed Tigers from the front. Brennan joined him, offering a cigarette. Jimmy took it, though he didn't usually smoke. The tobacco tasted bitter and harsh, matching his mood. Logistics says they're rushing more sabot rounds into production, Brennan said, staring at the darkening sky. Word spreading fast. Every tank crew in the division wants them now. Jimmy nodded silently. He thought about the German lieutenant he had glimpsed being led away by guards. The man had looked old, tired, defeated, not by bullets or explosions, but by the realization that everything he trusted had failed him. Jimmy understood that feeling intimately. Your brother would be proud, Brennan added quietly, would he? Tommy had believed in their cause, in fighting fascism, in making the world better through sacrifice. But war had a way of making everything gray and complicated. The Tiger crews were sons and brothers too, dying far from home because their leaders had chosen ambition over peace. Maybe, Jimmy finally said, exhaling smoke into the cold night, I in the distance. More artillery rumbled. The war continued, indifferent to individual victories or losses. Tomorrow there would be more battles, more Tigers, more crews who would die or survive based on luck and ammunition type. But tonight, the myth was broken. And broken myths, Jimmy thought, could never be fully repaired. The prisoner of war compound was a hastily erected collection of tents and wire fencing behind Canadian lines. Lieutenant Carl Fisher sat on a wooden bench inside an interrogation tent, his uniform still smelling of smoke and defeat. Across from him, a Canadian intelligence officer examined one of the sabot rounds, turning it over with the careful attention of someone studying an alien artifact. Armor-piercing, discarding sabot, the officer said in accented German, clearly proud of his language skills. A BDS, British and Canadian development. The metal casing, we call it the sabot, falls away after leaving the gun barrel. What remains is a tungsten carbide penetrator, subcaliber, traveling at extremely high velocity. He paused, watching Fisher's reaction. Velocity defeats armor better than mass at these ranges. Simple physics. Fisher said nothing. Name, rank, serial number. That was all the Geneva Convention required. But the officer wasn't really interrogating him about military intelligence. This felt more like a lecture, the victor explaining to the defeated exactly how they had lost. Your Tigers are impressive machines, the officer continued. 60 tons, 100mm frontal armor, the 88mm gun. Magnificent engineering. But engineering has limitations. He set the sabot round on the table between them. You built your tanks to withstand the weapons we had. We built new weapons to defeat the tanks you have. That's war. Action and reaction. Evolution. Through the tent wall, Fisher could hear his crew being processed. Hans's voice, still weak from shock, asking medical personnel about his burned hands. The driver wanting to know if they would be separated. Young men trying to understand how their invincible tank had become their prison so quickly. The Americans call your Tigers heavy tanks, the officer said. We call them mobile fortresses. But fortresses can be conquered with the right tools, Herr Lieutenant. Your crew mocked our Shermans. Called them Ronsons, yes? Lighters that burn easily. His expression hardened. The Sherman crews call their tanks death traps. They know every weakness. They crew them anyway, because someone has to stop people like your Führer. Fisher looked up at that, meeting the Canadian's eyes. He saw anger there, but also something else. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. Soldier to soldier, both understanding the impossible situation war creates. "I am not a Nazi," Fisher said quietly in English, breaking his silence. "I am a soldier. I follow orders." "So did the men who died in your Tiger's gun sights," the officer replied. "So do the men in my unit who died today. Following orders doesn't absolve us of what we do with those orders." The conversation died there. The officer gathered his materials and left, taking the sabot round with him. Fisher sat alone, thinking about armor and velocity, about myths and reality, about the moment when his invincible tank had proven to be very, very mortal. Miles away at the Canadian staging area, Corporal Jimmy McLeod attended a field service for the fallen. A chaplain spoke words about duty and sacrifice while 11 pairs of boots stood in formation, representing the crews who wouldn't return home. McLeod stood at the back, holding his brother's letter but not reading it. He had memorized every word months ago. The chaplain finished with a prayer. Some men bowed their heads. Others stared at the horizon where artillery continued its distant rumbling. Bobby Chin cried quietly, having learned the dead included a driver he had trained with. Brennan stood rigid, maintaining the sergeant's mask of strength even as his jaw clenched with suppressed emotion. After the service, a young replacement gunner approached McLeod nervously. The kid couldn't have been older than 19, fresh-faced and terrified. He carried a sabot round, holding it like a religious relic. "Corporal McLeod?" "Sir, I heard you were the first to kill a tiger with these." He held up the round. "I'm assigned to Lieutenant Cooper's crew. We ship out tomorrow. Does it really work? Does it actually penetrate?" Jimmy studied the young soldier, seeing his own fear reflected back. How many times had he asked similar questions, seeking reassurance from veterans who knew the answers were never simple? "It works," Jimmy said finally. "The shell penetrates tiger armor. The science is sound, but the shell alone doesn't win battles." The replacement looked confused. "But if it can kill tigers, you still have to get close enough to fire it," Jimmy interrupted gently. "You still have to face the fear that the tiger will see you first, fire first, kill you first. The sabot round gives us a weapon that works. It doesn't make us bulletproof. It doesn't make the war easier. It just means we can fight back." The young gunner absorbed this, his hopeful expression fading into something more realistic. He thanked McLeod and walked away, clutching his sabot round like a talisman that might keep him alive. Brennan appeared beside Jimmy, lighting a cigarette. New shipment of ammunition arrived. 50 sabot rounds per tank. Command is prioritizing them for frontline units. The word is spreading through the entire Allied tank force. "Good," Jimmy said, meaning it. Other crews deserve the same chance as it gotten. The same opportunity to fight back against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. "There's more," Brennan continued. "Intelligence says German tank production is shifting. They're abandoning super heavy tank projects, focusing on more mobile designs. Our sabot rounds changed their entire strategic calculation." He paused. "We might have actually changed the war today, Jimmy. Changed the war." McLeod thought about that as he looked across the camp at Canadian crews working on their Shermans, loading the new ammunition, preparing for tomorrow's battles. The Tigers would still be dangerous. German resistance would continue. Men would still die in burning tanks. But now the Sherman crews had hope, which was sometimes more powerful than armor. That night, Jimmy climbed into a sleeping bag, but didn't sleep. He thought about his brother Tommy, about Lieutenant Fisher and his burning tiger, about the replacement gunner carrying his sabot round like a prayer. He thought about the strange mathematics of war, where better weapons meant more killing, where victory and loss tangled together until they became indistinguishable. He took out Tommy's letter and read it one final time by flashlight. His brother had written about believing their sacrifice mattered, about fighting so future generations wouldn't have to. Tommy had died believing that. Maybe that belief was enough that McLeod carefully folded the letter and returned it to his pocket. Outside, guards patrolled the perimeter while exhausted tankers slept. Somewhere in the prisoner compound, German crews tried to understand how their fortress walls had crumbled. And in workshops across Allied territory, workers manufactured more sabot rounds, more odd-shaped shells that looked wrong but worked perfectly. The myth of tiger invincibility was broken. But myths could be replaced with new ones, new beliefs, new hopes. Tomorrow the war would continue. Tanks would clash. Men would die. But the crews climbing into their Shermans would do so with ammunition that gave them a fighting chance. Sometimes in war, that was all anyone could ask for. The strange shells with their discarding metal casings had done more than pierce armor. They had pierced the darkness of hopelessness, letting in a sliver of light. And in that light, soldiers found the courage to face another day, another battle, another chance to survive. The war was far from over. But the balance had shifted, one odd-shaped shell at a time.